It all started on a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind where the air hums with heat and the pavement shimmers like glass. The community pool had always been the heart of the neighborhood, the laughter of children echoing off the water, the soft splash of diving boards, and the smell of sunscreen drifting through the air. It was a small sanctuary for families, especially for parents who spent long weeks working and just wanted a few carefree hours with their kids. For years, everything ran smoothly. The pool was maintained by community fees, residents followed a few simple rules, and everyone respected one another's space. That is, until she arrived, Karen, the newly appointed HOA president. Her rise to power was swift and unexpected. With her perfectly pressed blouse, clipboard in hand, and a permanent look of disapproval, she took charge as if she'd been elected to govern a small nation instead of a suburban neighborhood. Karen's mission, as she claimed, was to restore order and preserve property values. But to the families who lived there, it felt more like she wanted to drain the joy out of everything that made the community worth living. First, her rules were small annoyances: banning inflatable pool toys for being unsightly, limiting pool hours, and issuing warnings about excessive noise. But soon, she turned her attention to something far more drastic. It happened one Friday morning when residents found a new laminated sign bolted to the pool gate. The bold letters screamed across it in red ink, effective immediately: no children under 16 allowed in pool area without HOA approval. The message spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Parents were stunned. The pool, the very heart of the community, had just been taken away from the kids who loved it most. Karen justified the rule by claiming safety concerns and insurance liability, but it was clear to everyone that her real motivation was control. One resident in particular took the news harder than most: a father named Mark Benson. He had 2 young children, ages 8 and 10, who spent nearly every afternoon at that pool. It was where they made friends, learned to swim, and built memories. For Mark, who worked long hours as a construction supervisor, those few hours at the pool with his kids were priceless. That evening, when his children returned home disappointed after being turned away by Karen herself, Mark felt something inside him snap. He wasn't just angry, he was insulted. The HOA was supposed to serve the community, not dictate who could enjoy its facilities. But Karen didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, she doubled down on her enforcement. She installed cameras at the pool entrance, citing security, though everyone knew she used them to monitor residents. She even sent violation letters to parents whose children had been seen near the gate, accusing them of attempting unauthorized entry. It was becoming unbearable. What was once a vibrant, friendly neighborhood now felt tense and divided. Parents whispered complaints at mailboxes, kids played indoors instead of outside, and the summer that should have been filled with laughter turned silent. Mark tried to reason with the HOA, sending polite emails, requesting meetings, and even attending a board session. But every attempt hit the same brick wall: Karen's cold, smug smile and her rehearsed line about regulations being for everyone's benefit. The other board members, worn down or intimidated, simply nodded along with whatever she said. Still, Mark wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. Years of working in construction had taught him patience, persistence, and the importance of reading the fine print. So, one night, after the kids went to bed, he sat down at his dining table with a cup of black coffee and decided to dig. He started with the HOA's publicly available documents: community bylaws, meeting notes, and property maintenance records. It was tedious, legal-heavy reading, but Mark had a sharp eye for details. He highlighted references to the pool, noting mentions of maintenance responsibilities and usage guidelines. Yet, something seemed off. There were no references, none at all, to ownership. The HOA talked about managing the pool, maintaining it, and enforcing rules, but nowhere did it explicitly say they owned it. Curiosity turned into obsession. Mark spent hours online researching county property records, HOA tax filings, and archived land deeds. What he found left him stunned. The pool, the one Karen was so proudly policing, wasn't legally listed under the HOA's name at all. It was still owned by the original property developer, a company that had gone defunct years ago. That meant the HOA had never legally acquired ownership of the pool. They were simply maintaining it, and had absolutely no legal right to restrict access or enforce new policies. Mark leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. For weeks, he had watched families suffer under Karen's petty tyranny, and now, in his hands, he held the truth that could bring her entire rule crashing down. But Mark knew he couldn't act rashly. If he confronted Karen too soon, she'd try to bury him in technicalities or manipulate the board again. He needed evidence, a clear paper trail that no one could deny. So he printed the property records, highlighted the relevant sections, and stored them in a folder labeled HOA Lies. From that night on, his mission was clear. He was going to expose Karen, and he was going to do it in a way the entire neighborhood would see. As summer reached its peak, tensions continued to rise. Karen began threatening fines to anyone who questioned her rules. Parents grew more frustrated, kids more restless, and Mark, quietly, began building his case. He gathered witness statements, recorded meetings, and collected every notice, every letter, every sign Karen had posted. The neighborhood might not have known it yet, but change was coming. Because the one thing Karen hadn't considered in all her self-appointed authority was that her power was built on a foundation of assumption, not ownership. And soon, Mark was going to make sure everyone knew it. The following weeks became a quiet storm beneath the surface of the neighborhood. On the outside, everything appeared calm. The trimmed lawns, the freshly painted fences, the glimmering but eerily empty pool. Yet, behind closed doors, the families were growing restless. The tension had become almost physical, like static in the air waiting to spark. Mark continued his quiet investigation, working long nights under the soft hum of his desk lamp. Every document, every line of fine print seemed to add another piece to the puzzle. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. The HOA had been operating on assumptions, not facts. The pool had been built as a community amenity by the property developer, but ownership was never transferred to the HOA after construction. When the developer's company dissolved, the rights to the land, including the pool, technically became part of a public trust. This meant that, legally, the HOA was nothing more than a caretaker of the pool, not its owner. Their so-called rules were more suggestions than enforceable law. Still, Mark knew that revealing this information too soon could backfire. Karen had built her reputation on intimidation and manipulation. If she caught wind of his findings, she would twist the narrative, painting him as a troublemaker, a conspiracy theorist, or worse, a threat to community harmony. So he bided his time, gathering evidence piece by piece. He contacted the county clerk's office for official records, requested the original plat maps from the city archives, and confirmed every signature and date. When the final piece of proof arrived, a certified copy of the deed showing the pool's legal status, he knew he had everything he needed. Meanwhile, the community continued to suffer under Karen's rule. Parents who dared question her received passive-aggressive reminder letters about trash bins or lawn lengths. One mother was fined for hanging towels on her balcony. Another was accused of disturbing the peace because her children played catch in the driveway. The HOA meetings had become more like court hearings, with Karen seated at the head of the table like a judge, her clipboard stacked with violation notices. Residents whispered complaints but stayed silent when she spoke, too weary or intimidated to fight. But Mark noticed something else: cracks forming in Karen's control. The once loyal board members had grown uneasy. They didn't like the endless conflict or the angry emails from residents. And when attendance at HOA meetings started to drop, the pressure began to shift. Karen's confidence, once unshakable, started to waver behind her polite smile. Mark saw his opening at the next HOA meeting. He arrived early, his folder of documents neatly organized and his notes prepared. The meeting room was small, just a community center with folding chairs and a whiteboard. But that night, it felt like an arena. Residents filled every seat, some standing in the back, all waiting for the same thing: an explanation for why their kids still couldn't use the pool in the middle of summer. Karen began, as always, with her usual tone of control and condescension. She spoke about order, liability, and community image. She mentioned that any rule violations would result in fines, and she proudly announced that new enforcement measures would be implemented next week. That was when Mark raised his hand. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He simply stood, holding a stack of papers. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward him. Karen's expression tightened. Without emotion, without accusation, Mark began to read from the documents. The property deed, the development plan, the legal record showing that the HOA had never owned the pool. He explained, step by step, how the HOA had been operating outside its authority. Every word was precise, factual, and irrefutable. As he spoke, the room shifted. The quiet frustration that had lingered for months now transformed into disbelief, and then anger. Parents exchanged glances, board members leaned forward to read the documents, and Karen's face went pale. Still, she tried to regain control. She spoke over him, accused him of misinterpreting legal terms, of spreading misinformation. But Mark had anticipated that. He pulled out the final piece, a signed letter from the county property office confirming that the HOA had no ownership rights over the pool. The effect was instant. The board members stared at the paper in shock. The residents began murmuring loudly, demanding explanations. Karen's words faltered, her voice trembling as she tried to defend herself. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she had no ground to stand on. That night, everything changed. The board voted to suspend the no kids policy immediately, pending a legal review. Karen objected, of course, but her protests were drowned out by applause from the residents. The crowd cheered for the first time in months, the air thick with a mix of relief and vindication. But Mark wasn't done yet. He knew Karen would try to fight back, that she'd find another angle, another rule, another excuse, so he prepared for the next step. The following morning, he contacted a local reporter who covered community affairs. He shared the documents, the timeline, and the HOA's overreach. Within days, an article appeared online. Local HOA bans kids from pool it doesn't own. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Other HOAs across the state began facing scrutiny, parents rallied online, and soon the once powerful Karen became a symbol of everything people hated about overzealous neighborhood associations. In the neighborhood itself, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Children returned to the pool, splashing and laughing under the summer sun. The same pool Karen once tried to gatekeep now became the symbol of freedom and unity. Still, Karen wasn't finished. Public humiliation had only made her more determined to regain control. She started sending letters to the board, threatening lawsuits, claiming defamation, and misuse of HOA authority. But Mark knew this was her last stand. The truth was out, and the community finally had the power she once held. He watched from his porch as families walked past, towels draped over their shoulders, the sound of kids playing drifting through the evening air. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt alive again. But Mark also knew something Karen didn't. The legal review of the HOA's actions had uncovered more than just the pool issue. There were financial discrepancies, missing maintenance funds, and unauthorized spending, all of which traced back to Karen's tenure. And soon, that truth would come crashing down too. By late summer, the neighborhood that once lived under Karen's thumb had transformed into something unrecognizable. The sound of children's laughter had returned to the pool. Sprinklers ticked across green lawns, and neighbors actually smiled at one another again. The fear that once hovered over the community like a shadow had lifted. But behind the calm surface, something far bigger was brewing. After Mark's public revelation and the viral article, the county's housing commission had opened an investigation into the HOA's practices. What started as a question about pool ownership quickly spiraled into a full-scale audit. For years, Karen had ruled with unchecked authority, issuing fines, reallocating funds, and enforcing policies that often benefited her inner circle. Now, every dollar and every decision was being examined. Mark hadn't sought revenge at first. He simply wanted fairness. But as the investigation unfolded, what he uncovered was worse than he ever expected. The HOA's financial records were a mess. Maintenance invoices had been inflated, and certain contractors paid by the HOA didn't actually exist. When auditors followed the paper trail, it led directly back to Karen, to her personal account and her husband's small consulting company, which had received several mysterious payments for community improvements. It was fraud, plain and simple. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who once feared her now whispered openly about her greed. The same people who once trembled at the sight of her clipboard now laughed when she walked by. The aura of power she had built was dissolving, replaced by suspicion, embarrassment, and a growing sense of poetic justice. Karen, however, refused to go down quietly. She claimed she was being framed, that Mark had manipulated the board, and that the audit was a witch hunt. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The board, once her loyal followers, had turned against her. The evidence was undeniable, the numbers irrefutable. At the next HOA meeting, the largest the community had ever seen, the truth was laid bare. Rows of residents filled the chairs, their faces a mixture of anger and anticipation. At the front sat Karen, visibly trembling but trying to maintain her usual air of superiority. The board treasurer, reading from the audit report, detailed every instance of financial misconduct. The fake invoices, the unauthorized withdrawals, the personal reimbursements. Each revelation hit like a hammer blow. The room was silent except for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional gasp. When the final number was read, the total amount Karen had misused, a murmur rippled through the crowd. She had taken thousands of dollars from the community she claimed to protect. When the report ended, Karen tried to speak, but her words were drowned by the residents demanding her removal. For the first time in her reign, she was powerless. The board held an immediate vote, and with a unanimous decision, Karen was stripped of her presidency and permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership role. The following week, she moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Some said she couldn't handle the humiliation. Others believed she was avoiding further legal trouble. Her once pristine house stood empty for months, a silent monument to the downfall of the self-proclaimed protector of community standards. As for Mark, his quiet persistence had made him something of a local hero. The board offered him a position as a temporary advisor to help reestablish fair policies. But he declined. He didn't want power, he wanted peace. His goal had always been to give the community back to the people who lived in it. He continued to attend meetings, helping when needed, but mostly he focused on his family. That summer, he spent every weekend at the pool with his kids, watching them dive and laugh, the sun glinting off the water that had caused so much chaos, and ultimately, so much change. The neighborhood, free from Karen's grip, began to flourish again. The new HOA board rolled back many of her old restrictions, reintroduced community events, and rebuilt trust among residents. The tension that once divided them now served as a reminder, a lesson in what happens when people stop questioning authority and let one person take too much control. And though Karen was gone, her story became something of a legend. New families who moved into the neighborhood would eventually hear about the pool scandal, usually shared in hushed but amused tones at block parties or late-night barbecues. Mark never bragged about what he'd done. He didn't need to. The justice had spoken for itself. The pool sparkled again, filled with life and laughter, owned not by a tyrant in a blazer, but by the community it was always meant. 4.1 Quiet evening. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, Mark sat on a poolside bench, watching his kids play. The water shimmered gold beneath the fading light. Around him, parents chatted, kids raced, and the faint hum of crickets began to rise. It felt peaceful, the kind of peace that comes only after a long, hard fight for what's right. He thought back to the sign that had started it all. The bold red letters banning children from the pool. That sign had been Karen's symbol of control, her way of separating herself from everyone else. Now, that same space on the gate held a new sign, handwritten by one of the neighborhood kids. Welcome, everyone. It wasn't official, and it didn't need to be. The pool was theirs again, and so was their freedom. And though Karen's name would fade with time, the story of how one determined father exposed the truth would never be forgotten. It would live on as a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful act of revenge isn't shouting or fighting, but simply shining a light on the truth.